Oh, thank you. Thanks. Actually, not but thank you. Good. Well, welcome to the afternoon session of this hugely, to me at least, stimulating symposium, Conserving Active Matter. I've learned so much already. We've just seen the creation of a conservation nightmare. In spite of the words, nothing's going to change my world. How wrong can you be? You're on.
Oh, I'm on. Thank you all so much. Some of you have already heard me say, I feel like I should go home right now and just sort through all of the amazing stuff that you have given us. And it's really been an incredible morning and yesterday's session as well. From the outset of this project, we've been trying to understand just what active matter might be. It seems to mean different things to different people. One thing that philosophy has to contribute, we hope, is to help clarify the concept itself. In fact, this is one of the things that philosophers do. We work on getting clear about concepts. Are there things that all active matter has in common? Are there things that distinguish active matter from all other neighboring concepts, like entropy? A precise definition, or set of definitions, that provides what we call necessary and sufficient conditions. Necessary and sufficient conditions would tell you what all and only active matter is. So a precise definition that provides necessary and sufficient conditions might be nice, but if it proves hopeless, as it often does, at least we might be able to help say something about why the concept resists definition of this sort. Another thing that philosophy is good for is that it can clarify the uses to which the concept active matter is put and ask whether we ultimately even need the concept at all. So we're hoping eventually to turn to this. Before setting out a framework for considering the puzzles presented by active matter from philosophical perspectives, we want to make it plain that in speaking of matter of whatever kind, we are seeking to outline considerations anterior to those that might affect ideas about whether any matter might be active in the sense of being animate or endowed with personhood. That is a puzzle for both biologists, who consider the vexed question of what life might be, and for the working group on indigenous ontologies. We'll hear from soon.
Is there a difference in kind between active matter and other possible types of matter? Or alternatively, are we dealing with a difference of degree rather than of kind? Degrees of activity in all matter. But let's be clear about what we mean by matter. We take matter to be constituted of atomic particles, either independently, as in the case of elements, or in molecular combinations. We take matter to be that which occupies space. Since the 18th century, philosophers have commonly captured this notion with the concept extension or extended. Matter is that which is extended. How does matter change? Now, a full discussion of that is really far beyond us. As you all know, scientists usually speak of two basic types of change to matter, chemical and physical. Chemical change occurs when atoms and molecules interact, bond or rebond, to form new materials. A change is physical when the subject matter to change retains the subject that is matter that is subject to change retains its underlying atomic or molecular identity. Many physical changes can be easily reversed, whereas chemical changes either cannot be reversed or cannot be reversed without extraordinary effort. A shift in the energy environment of matter can bring about physical change, as in the case of exposure of matter to radiation in the form of waves or subatomic particles. A shift in the energy environment can result in changes in the state of matter. Matter exists in a variety of states. Matter can exist in as many as 7 states, but even though approximately 99% of known matter in the universe exists as plasma, we hope we are only going to have to deal with 3: solids, liquids, and gases. External conditions affect the state of any given matter, so water can freeze to form solid ice, yet remain the same in chemical terms as when it was a liquid. Ice and water are two states of H2O. A further type of physical change is isotopic. Elements, matter not reducible to further atomic constituents, exist in a variety of isotopes. An isotope is a form of an element that contains the same number of protons as other forms of the same element, but that has a different number of neutrons in its nucleus. Therefore, each isotope of any given element differs from other isotopes of the same element in relative atomic mass, but not in chemical properties. There are, for instance, 69 possible isotopes of gold, only one of which, gold 197, can be counted notionally stable. The radioisotopes of gold decay at various rates from 300 nanoseconds to 2.69848 days, though they invariably retain 79 protons in each of their atomic nuclei.
Whatever the changes any matter undergoes, whether chemical, radiological, state, or isotopic, that matter is perpetually, actually, or potentially unstable. Matter is unstable owing to its propensity to change on any or all of the items we have just outlined. Therefore, we'd be hard-pressed to identify any matter in the known universe that is perfectly stable. Is active an antonym of stable? Should all matter that is unstable be counted active, or is active matter some special species of unstable matter that differs in kind from other unstable matter? If, as we suspect, the activity of active matter is no more than a variant of instability, it constitutes no distinct kind. In that case, active matter is simply a species of unstable matter, its distinction, if any, from other unstable matter being at most one of degree. If there is indeed wholly stable matter in the universe, that is, matter not subject to change under any circumstances, we would allow that there would be a difference in kind between the putative stable matter and other matter, whether unstable alone or both unstable and active matter as separate kinds. But this seems unlikely. If no one can demonstrate the existence of active matter as a distinct kind, if we speak of active matter, we speak not of some kind of matter distinct from others, but, for all practical purposes, of all known matter. In that case, the only purpose of the term would be to recast matter, previously conceived of as stable or stabilizable, as unstable. In these circumstances, active would be no more than a synonym for unstable. A reconception of matter on these terms as unstable entails not recognizing a special, distinct kind of matter, active matter, but rather that matter has properties hitherto or under-recognized. Those properties relate to change, for matter as we know it is in flux in one way or another, changing in a matter of nanoseconds or over eons. In that case, our task would be not to reconceive one kind of matter as distinct from the rest, but to recognize the properties of all matter as we know it, properties dominated by instability.
Now, this might be inconvenient for certain kinds of conservation practice, for it has long been premised on the desirability of stability. We're well aware that many conservators recognize the elusiveness of stability and the impossibility of returning a thing to an earlier state following the changes it has undergone. Yet for many, attaining stability, even if impossible in practice, remains an ideal and governs aims and practice. Instead of imagining stability as the default state of matter, we might do better to imagine instability as chronically inevitable. This is so regardless of whether active matter is a distinct kind or no more than a subset of unstable matter that differs from all other matter only in degree. The search for an ideal of stability by conservators is doomed to disappointment because stability is unattainable. Anyone who's watched a watercolor drawing fade, silver tarnish, a video degrade, or Mark Rothko's so-called Harvard murals decay might intuit as much. Conservation can be no more than an attempt to manage change, not arrest it, let alone reverse it. This realization requires no great theoretical leap, rather a simple adjustment.
So where do we, the Philosophy Working Group, go from here? Sherry Irvin and Carolyn Korsmeyer will outline some further puzzles and approaches. Meanwhile, in the long term, we do not expect to concentrate overmuch on the adjustment we've just defined. Instead, we expect to focus on two related puzzles that promise to be more challenging, we think. First, why do some communities so value an ideal of matter as stable that they take elaborate pains to try to ensure it through preservation, restoration, and conservation? Second, why do some communities so value an ideal of matter as changeable, often through degradation and decay, that they lend privilege to things that have changed or continue to change? Some communities ascribe to both of these values in respect of different things, or, in some instances, even of the same things. Rust, for instance, can be undesirable from one viewpoint, yet highly valued from another. Our share of this project will be to establish definitions of some of the phenomena grouped under the phrase, the ravages of time, most particularly by seeking to answer the question that seems to run counter to the assumptions underlying much conservation practice. Can aging and degradation improve an artifact? And if so, under what conditions? And I should say, Ivan and I have been working for some time on a project that thinks about the aesthetic value of degradation, the way in which things can become aesthetically more interesting or accrue other kinds of aesthetic value, precisely through the processes of degradation and decay. What might the implications of such questions be for conservation and other institutionalized forms of practice?
In addition, we invite you to pause to examine the institutional status of our shared endeavors. As this project begins, we're all preparing to seek a modification of institutional assumptions and practices. Yet we should not assume that we are about to make new epistemological proposals, let alone discover some previously unrecognized ontological truth. Therefore, we suggest that we bear in mind the caution and skepticism expressed by the Jamaican cultural theorist Stuart Hall in the preface to the posthumously published texts of lectures he gave in 1983. I quote, "The notion that theory progresses by a sudden epistemological rupture with all the bad theories that preceded it, by a sudden leap into science, which only requires that one now unfolds the concepts in all their rigorous purity, without any further need to think again for another epoch, is the summit of rationalist illusion." And something additional happens when a set of discourses and practices are institutionalized. They are concretized in a particular form, in a program of activities and a specific socially composed group of people. Hall alerts us to our own condition in this very group, and further, that we are in constant danger of attempting to scale the summit of rationalist illusion. Let us therefore proceed with skepticism and caution, recognizing that what to some may appear to be a mountain whose peak is lost in clouds may turn out to be no more than the proverbial molehill. We now have the pleasure of introducing our two invited speakers, both philosophers of distinction. We shall introduce them both in just a moment. But first I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the two of us, Anne and me, to acknowledge the support of the Advanced Study Institute of the Georg August Universität in Göttingen, where I'm a permanent senior fellow and where the award of a senior fellowship to Anne last summer allowed us to torture one another with these questions in optimal circumstances. Carolyn Korsmeyer is professor of philosophy at the University of Buffalo, State University of New York, where she spent her entire scholarly career, rising from assistant to full professor and department chair. Her influential contributions to contemporary philosophy have been in aesthetics, the theory of senses and the emotions, and in feminism. She's the author or editor of 11 books, notably Savoring Disgust, The Foul and the Fair in Aesthetics from 2011, Her volume Ruins, Monuments and Memorials, Philosophical Perspectives on Artifact and Memory, edited with Jeanette Bicknell and Jennifer Judkins, is currently in preparation. It's been my great pleasure and privilege to have known Professor Korsmeier through our membership of the American Society for Aesthetics, of which she was president between 2005 and 2007, and our service together on the board of the journal Contemporary Aesthetics over the last 14 years. So Carolyn's paper today is Staying in Touch with the Past, and we'll introduce Sherry.
I will introduce Sherry. I want to say can I just add one thing to your introduction of Carolyn, which is that she is really the founder, I would say, of the field of feminist aesthetics, which is my whole life, and is really one of my heroes for that. And so I'm really, really important. It is a great honor to introduce Sherry Irvin. She is Presidential Research Professor of Philosophy and Women and Gender Studies and co-director of the Center for Social Justice at the University of Oklahoma. She specializes in aesthetics and the philosophy of art and the philosophy of race. She has authored a series of influential articles, most notably for our topic today, The Artist's Sanction in Contemporary Art and Scratching an Itch, both in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. Her edited volume for Oxford University Press, Body Aesthetics, appeared last year and is really a terrific collection of essays that I think is going to have a really important impact on our field. That was a really great thing to have done. She is currently completing a monograph for the same publisher, Immaterial, A Philosophy of Contemporary Art. Professor Irvin will speak today on welcome and unwelcome material change.
So Carol, you're on.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone picking me up from all over? Thank you. I've been extremely interested in listening to all the presentations here. It seems to me that we have been moving in a kind of bouncy way between very micro-level analyses of activity and then rather loftier ones, and I think I'm going to be somewhere in the middle. I'm going to be talking about what we might consider to be very ordinary objects, sometimes works of art, sometimes not. Because today I would like to explore the conditions under which old things, and everything eventually becomes old unless it just disappears, can conjure up encounters with the past. And by encounter here, I mean a heightened awareness of an object that embodies its history, when the sheer age, uniqueness, or specialness of an object evokes marvel, or curiosity, or your fascination of some sort. The thrill of holding an ancient coin, for example, or the wonderful example that intrigued me that came up last night in Justin Broke's presentation, the folded Dürer picture that was evidently carried around like a kind of talisman for a while, or the awe of standing before a Paleolithic painting. Or, I would add a slightly goofy, but I think far from insignificant example, the strange intimacy of holding a lock of David Bowie's hair, which was auctioned off on eBay last summer. So what needs to be retained, preserved, conserved, or whatever, to afford such encounters and to safeguard future encounters with our own times? To anticipate my answer, which is going to sound awfully stodgy, it is important to preserve the material real thing. For me, real thing is a technical term, I capitalize it. And not something that simply looks just like the original, in its simplest form, not a replica. The immediate problem, however, as I'm sure is quickly realizable, is how even to identify, let alone conserve, the real thing when everything changes over time. This is particularly obvious with things that are made from noticeably active matter, like molds, but it's a problem that pertains with virtually all artifacts, and it's especially dramatic and brutal now with artifacts under siege from development or from acts of war. Of particular interest to me are artifacts that in principle appear to be stable, but whose nature and function routinely mandate replacement of parts from time to time. I don't mean that they're decaying. I mean that the kind of thing they are means that usually you have to repair them from time to time. And the examples I particularly have in mind are things like buildings. So I hope today to try to bridge the apparent gap between active and passive matter. Several people have already spoken to that from different perspectives, by stressing a view of objects that stresses their inherently vague boundaries, and to make a case for a rather traditional view of preservation and conservation, but from a slightly different perspective, reflecting upon what can be touched. Now, to stay in touch has a common metaphorical usage, though I'd like to draw out the literal basis for the expression. Touch is the sense, I should stress that our encounters with things are always multisensory, but I'm going to focus on touch because I think it's frequently a sense that is not given due credit for the role that it plays. So touch is the sense that registers tactile qualities such as sticky or smooth, but it's also a fundamental sense for judging the movement of one's body and locating oneself in relation to other things, including for registering proximity, which puts touch in play even absent actual contact, which is quite important because frequently we can't touch the things that we're concerned with. Either they're too far away, like on a ceiling, or we're simply not permitted to. This observation grounds the claims of philosophers from antiquity to the present that it's touch that most reliably registers physical reality. Here are a bunch of quotes that back me up, just so I've got a little bit of support behind me, although I'm not going to read all of them. The role of touch in gauging our relationship to other things is painfully obvious when you walk into a table in the dark. But the fact that one is close enough to touch is also at work when one is in the presence of something of value, including things that are very old, strange, unique, or works of unusual creativity. The role of touch is more obvious with things that one literally handles, such as ancient coins, or with objects where location is paramount, such as prehistoric painted caves, where the physical effort of getting there is part of the encounter. But even without actual physical contact, the sense of touch is fundamental to registering where one is located in relation to things in shared space. In contrast, a replica looks the same, but is not the same thing, although it may be perceptually indiscernible from the original. Therefore, one can easily be fooled about being in the presence of the real thing, and that has to be acknowledged. Deception aside, this issue is especially thorny because it is the nature of an artifact such as a building to have replaced parts that replicate damaged ones: windows, roof tiles, cornices, wallpaper, and so forth. Buildings, while passive and inert from one perspective, from another are highly active in their requirements for repair. And yet, as a rule, we have no trouble identifying a repaired building as the same building as the one that was falling down. Now, I have found one particular example to be fruitful in sorting through the changes that even massive material structures undergo, and that is the extensive residence that Frank Lloyd Wright built for Darwin Martin and his family in Buffalo in the first years of the 20th century. While two sections from the first construction remain, large portions of this were destroyed in 1960 to make way for an apartment building. Furniture, windows, and decorative fragments were dispersed to collectors or galleries or destroyed, or simply lost track of. That decision was later regretted, and early in this century, the apartments were torn down and the destroyed parts reconstructed, an accomplishment made possible by Wright's architectural drawings, early photographs, and the availability of historically appropriate manufacturing methods. The reconstruction, the photo on the bottom is from the main residence that was not torn down. The panoramic photo pieced together at the top shows you the part from the back of the main building down to a conservatory, all of which was destroyed. But it was very important for those who were overseeing the reconstruction that they make brick in the way that Wright made brick, that the windows were manufactured in a similar way, and so forth, insofar as that was possible. So the entire complex contains traditionally conceived passive matter, such as bricks and pipes, with familiar active matter, because the gardens were part of the design as well. And over time, these are being replanted. The insert at the upper right of the slide shows you a portion of Wright's ground floor drawing that included the planting he envisioned. While large trees of the sort that once stood on the property will take years to grow, the smaller plantings are being, quote, restored, which in this case requires replacement of kind rather than conservation of material thing, although I think it's important to point out that even plants, especially trees, can achieve the status of unique individuals, and when they're destroyed, they can't be replaced, or they're just often mourned. However, certain updates were mandated. Being a building that people frequently visit, the house was brought up to code, although the former curator insisted that a portion of the original asbestos insulation be preserved behind a transparent panel. This may seem a quirky decision without much consequence, but in fact I think it points to a really tricky issue. If we decide to leave the old materials in place, we not only violate improved safety regulations, but we also don't acknowledge that it's in the nature of buildings to be repaired and updated from time to time. We treat them as a kind of thing that they are not. On the other hand, if we decide that the innards don't matter because they're hidden, then we might be implying that only surface appearance matters, which overlooks the real tangible thing and does not differentiate the values of replica and original. The windows of the Martin House provide an excellent intuition pump for deciding when and why it matters that real originals be in place. Philosophers like to use the term intuition pump, which refers to examples that challenge presumptions or make us examine grounds for views and sometimes leave us bewildered. I suspect that few people would endorse the idea that because, I'm skipping something here. Windows, of which you see some photographs from the early days, were of great importance for Wright. He called them light screens, and he had 394 of them installed in the Darwin-Martin complex in the form of windows, ley lights, and decorative glass panels, which you see in the middle here. Some of these remained in the standing buildings, some were destroyed. Some lost, some have been located and returned, many located and not returned. Many are being replicated for installation when it appears that the originals are unavailable. In the interim, before replication is completed, the museum has had plastic films made for the living room of the main building. I suspect that few people would endorse the idea that because the films look just like the famous Tree of Life windows, such as you see in the upper right-hand corner here, and I can assure you they do, they're perfect mimics. It doesn't matter that they're not the original windows. Here's a close-up. It's kind of blurry because I had to expand the slide. Plastic films just aren't the real thing, right? Here's intuition pumping, I hope in my direction. Now, as far as I know, the missing windows are not being repatriated from their current homes in the Corning Museum of Glass and the Chicago Art Institute. But just last month, 7 other light screens were returned by the Museum of the University of Victoria in British Columbia, where they had been held for 50 years. Curators from both institutions agree on the importance of this decision, and so do I. But on what grounds exactly? Consider this statement from the University of Victoria curator, Mary Jo Hughes. I've got it up here. We are doing the right thing, which I'm afraid was an inevitable pun, by reuniting these stunningly beautiful light screens within their original context, because Wright's work can only fully be understood when seen as a unified whole. And again, it's an important part of heritage preservation to have pieces together and to see the whole concept of a Frank Lloyd Wright design. Now, true as they are, these sentiments don't seem to me to get at the heart of the matter. After all, we can see the concept of a Wright design equally well with good replication, and there's no reason to think that indiscernible copies wouldn't yield the same understanding of cultural heritage, not if you're interested in the materials things are made out of necessarily, but in terms of the overall work of art that this architecture represents. The crucial reason it's important to have the first windows reinstalled is simple. They are what they appear to be. The windows designed for the Martin House. The replicas are like the originals, but they are something different. Now, perhaps my position advocates an illusion, because things always change. If you believe you are in touch with something old, you might really be encountering an indiscernible replacement part. This is certainly true, but continuity of materials can supplant retention of original stuff. And with things whose nature it is to be renewed from time to time, such as architecture, even replacement parts blend into that continuity, along with patina and signs of wear. The metaphysical position that I think best supports this view maintains that objects by their nature are vague, and I should say that vague theories of vagueness, are highly controversial in metaphysics, but I think they're quite sensible when we're dealing with what can be called medium-sized objects, things that are like ordinary objects, tables, chairs, cats, and dogs. Vagueness means that the identity of things cannot be specified in an ontologically strict way. Objects of art or nature rarely, if ever, possess crisp and unchangeable features. A building that loses a drain pipe has not lost its identity as the building it was before and after the storm that took down the gutters, any more than a tree that loses its leaves changes its identity as the tree that grew in the backyard. Things undergo changes that are proper to their natures, and some resist preservation altogether. Moreover, attention to materials also has to be sensibly conceived. For what qualifies an object as the same thing over time varies radically with its kind, and on this point, it might be illuminating to consider a type of active matter that's very familiar, and that is cuisines. And we got a little taste of that, unintentional pun, with this morning's comment about the starter stuff in the bread. Although in that case it's the starter that lasts and the bread that's remade, but cuisines get remade over and over. And a dish of rice and beans, for example, can be cooked repeatedly, each meal remaining an instance of that dish, despite inevitable differences such as the number of grains of rice in the pot, or even the proportion of beans to rice. Finally, sometimes there are situations that are simply indeterminate. I go back to the Martin complex for this. Part of the Martin complex is a small gardener's cottage. It was not destroyed by the development, but it was sold years ago to a private owner who added a large back room designed in the style of Wright. The back room is, from the interior, is at the top here, the top of the slide. The museum has kept the cottage with its recent extension intact as a guest house. Has the new room become part of the Darwin Martin complex? Though neither designed by Wright nor constructed during the early years when the rest was originally built. Maybe it almost has. For even a fragment of the first stuff can anchor new parts to the past, thus permitting me to defend material continuity amidst the hopelessness of permanence and the inevitability of change. Thank you.
No, I'm fine. Yeah. I have the mouse too. I haven't activated that. So I'm going to start with a confession. About 10 days ago, Carolyn and Ann and I were all at a philosophy of art conference in New Orleans, but it's my confession, it's not theirs. So Prospect 4, which is this big international contemporary art festival, was opening when we were there. So I went around to see the works, and I broke one of them. So I think this is a lifetime first for me. This is a work by Nama Tabar, and it's one of her works on felt, and it's a playable work. So this is a big piece of industrial felt, and it's got a piano string stretched from the upper right corner to the lower left, and I think it's anchored on like a guitar tuning peg or something. So you can play it, and you can manipulate the pitch by changing the felt, and I like stretched it too far, and it went bam, and like the string went, and then it went, and then after that, a museum staff member kind of followed me around the museum, getting details for his incident report. He was very apologetic, like it was all their fault that I broke it, and I was very apologetic too. And while we were talking, oh wait, I want to show you a little video of her. Let's see, of her and some collaborators. She's there on the right, but activating this piece while I speak. I'll just there we go. Okay. So anyway. So this is actually a composition that they did for this work. And the work I broke is the one on the left. And so while this museum staff member was following me around, I know that my speaking is just damaging the ambiance of the performance, but this video's online, you can watch it later. But what I found out was she was on her way to the museum. She was in town for the show, and she was on her way to give a talk about the work when I broke it. And so they called her, and they're like, uh-oh. And she said, okay, I'm going to grab a piano string. I'm going to see if I can get one and fix it real fast, because presumably during her talk, she was going to activate the work. So I was too sheepish to stick around and find out what happened next. But obviously, I inflicted a form of change on this work that was unwelcome from many perspectives, right? I didn't want to do it. She didn't want me to do it. The museum didn't want me to do it. And all the viewers lost the opportunity of, seeing it activated, interacting with it, performing it. This is going to stop soon. I know it's getting a little There we go. Okay. So the work, once I broke it, it looked wrong, it sounded wrong, it couldn't do any of the things it was designed to do. So the change that I inflicted was unwelcome from virtually every perspective, except maybe the people who saw me do it and who had a frisson of excitement of seeing somebody break this work in this kind of dramatic way. But anyway, of course they called her, and that's what you do with contemporary art. You call the artist if the artist is available. And this tendency to consult with the artist about material change and how it should be handled reflects a practice that has emerged in contemporary art specifically, which is about allowing artists to kind of specify that certain kinds of material change that would have been previously thought of as kind of external to the work, kind of circumstances of damage or things to be fixed, artists now have the ability to kind of stipulate through a process that I call the artist sanction in other work about this, that certain kinds of change are to be considered internal to the work now and not to be treated as circumstances to be managed. Obviously, she didn't do that here, but I want to talk about some works where artists have sort of welcomed certain kinds of change into their work and sort of think about how we should consider that, especially when there is resistance by others to this process of welcoming certain kinds of change. So this is a work by Paul-Émile Bourdieu, who's a Quebec painter, and he made the series of works in the middle of the 20th century when he was in Paris, and they are not supposed to be like this. Like, this is a conservation catastrophe where the black paint has just it's just flaking off all over the place. It's a complete nightmare. There's a sense in which, if you think of conservation theorist Salvador Munoz Viñas, he would say, well, this is the authentic condition of the work, in a sense. It really is in this condition. And also, the condition was produced by the structure and the materials by which the artist made the work. But at the same time, this is treated as an undesirable state. It's damage, and so there are these aggressive conservation measures to repair this work. So there's a confluence of factors that come together to make this change unwelcome. It's of a type that has traditionally, conventionally been thought of as unwelcome. It's not what the artist intended, and it also interferes with certain kinds of experiences that viewers have come to enjoy. So I gotta get rid of this so that I don't keep trying to press that. Which is of looking at, like this is another of his works where it's in a more pristine condition. People like these sort of unbroken, solid blacks, and so when the black starts to flake off and you have all this white coming through, it's just not it's not the kind of experience that he designed or that viewers are seeking. Now, on the other hand, around the same time, the Japanese Gutai artist Saburo Murakami created a small number of these peeling off paintings. And Paul Schimmel describes having borrowed one of these works, not the one pictured, for an exhibition that he was curating at the Geffen Contemporary at LA MoCA. And he says this. He says, although I had requested this piece, so they're designed to flake, and they're designed, like Murakami said, pieces can fall off. It's okay, that's what the work is. It's a peeling off painting. That's what's supposed to happen. So Schimmel says this, although I had requested this piece for the exhibition, I imagined it would be very difficult to get as it's very delicate. When it arrived in Los Angeles, the conservator who had traveled with it was anxiously awaiting the opening of the crate to see if the very large pieces on the left side of the painting had actually fallen off, but they were still there. I asked her, why did you lend it? It's such an incredibly fragile piece. And she replied, it's called peeling off painting, and that was Murakami's intention. And Schimmel says, I was amazed that she would allow the wishes of the artist to supersede her knowledge that eventual destruction would occur to this work of art. So in welcoming these forms of dramatic material change, Murakami sanctioned a rule for the conservation of his works, namely that they should not be subjected to forms of aggressive conservation treatment that are designed to reverse and prevent that stuff, which is what you see happening to the Bourgeois work here. Somebody's injecting some glue and so forth. So Murakami also, I suggest, thereby created a different work than if he had not welcomed this form of change into the work. That is, if we imagine two scenarios, each involving the same object subject to the same kinds of significant material change, but accompanied by different sanctions for how this change is to be addressed, with the artist welcoming the change in one scenario and prescribing resistance to the change in the other scenario, the works in these two scenarios are different artworks, because the welcoming of change as kind of interior to the work, rather than as an external circumstance to be managed, is part of the communicative artistic act that he's engaging in, and different communicative acts are subject to different kind of assignments of meaning, and that makes those two works, one real, one hypothetical, distinct artworks, I suggest. And in a similar fashion, Naama Tsabar could have created a work that internalizes the form of bedragglement to which I subjected her objects. This is a blurry, sheepish photograph that I took after I broke it, and you can see that it's kind of like hanging down limply, and you can't really see the piano string, but it's kind of blah, 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 in the middle of the work. And it could make sense, like given what she is thinking about, a work that incorporates this kind of damage as internal could be a coherent, sensible work, because here's some information about her artistic practice. So this is a quote from her website. Informed by her experiences as a musician in a punk band and as a bartender, Tsabar probes the culture of rock music from multiple angles, channeling the decadence of urban night culture and its association with danger, seduction, and subversion. And her work also, according to the statement, deals with power and gender dynamics of nightlife and the music scene. And an instrument being stretched beyond its limits and broken seems to fit right in with that. Moreover, few things in nightlife could be more familiar, especially to somebody who's been a bartender, than this sort of, things starting out fresh and new, and then like this range of outcomes from disappointment to, damage that happen in the course of a night. That seems like very much part of what you could be thinking about. But it's not. I mean, clearly that's not what she's up to. That would be a misreading of her work, which really aspires to maintaining a certain kind of form that facilitates interaction and performance. So to read her work as internalizing this decay would be wrong, because she does not embrace the decay, and the kind of work she's created doesn't embrace it. So the decay happens, it can still happen, but it's not, it's not subject to meaning assignment in the same way. But even when an artist does welcome material change, this doesn't erase a certain residue of resistance, right? So Schimmel mentions his amazement that the conservator would lend out the work. The conservator herself was anxious that parts were going to fall off. So, and in other cases that I'll talk about now, the resistance is even more pronounced. And so should this lead us to doubt that the artist actually does have the authority to welcome change? Like if others are resisting the welcoming, should we think the artist is only part of the picture and that whether change is welcome or not is more socially determined? I want to think about that. So the Perez Art Museum Miami holds a work, it's not this work, but it's a kind of similar work, by Felix Gonzalez Torres. It's a stack that he made in 1990. So these stacks are among his gifts to the public where people can just come and take a print away. And this particular work I'm talking about, they're white and they are embossed with dolphins. But this is one of the only stacks that like most of his stacks, many of you have probably seen them, they're indefinitely replenishable. The institution that holds them has to keep producing the prints and letting people take them away. But this is one of only a few that he made that's not replenishable. It was in a private collection, and the collector died, and at his funeral, people were permitted to take some sheets. But now it's in the collection of the museum, and they show it under a vitrine. They do not let people take any more away from this, because they're like, we're not letting our artwork like walk away. We're not doing that, right? So here's another example. This beginning in 1979, Gerald Ferguson, who was American but who worked most of his career in Canada, created over 100 of what he called maintenance paintings. They're quite small, as you can probably tell there. And the instructions on the back specify that their reinstallation and maintenance, repainting, is at the discretion of the end user. That is, like, owners can repaint them. He's welcoming this kind of material change. And in a later statement, he said, if someone bought a green painting, for example, and felt it would look better white, they could repaint it. That would be aesthetic maintenance. Now, I've argued that in the case of Murakami, as I've argued in the case of the Murakami painting, the fact that Ferguson sanctions repainting is integral to the nature of this work. It's a different work than it would have been if he hadn't sanctioned that. It renders the current appearance of the painting kind of contingent and non-essential, quite different from how it would be in a work of painting that wasn't repaintable in this way. But in the examples of these maintenance paintings that I've tracked down, nobody has fully taken up Ferguson's permission. So when institutions hold the works, they just leave them alone. And this particular one, this is held by a collector, and he sent me these pictures. He contracted with Ferguson himself, the artist, to do the repainting. So what you see, like, it's the surface after repainting on the left, and on the right, like, they put a second label down in the lower right that's all about how they made this contract and Ferguson repainted it himself. And then there's one other case that I've looked at, which is there's an artist who I know, John Murchie, who owns one of these, and he decided to repaint the edges, not the painted surface, but the edges to match his living room wall. And Ferguson was kind of pissed about this. Even though it didn't actually violate his rules, Ferguson he looked askance at this. So this is interesting, right? That there is this permission that's very clearly stated, and in a sense, like, nobody's really doubting the authority of this, but everybody's sort of like, we're not sure we want to do this. So what is this tendency? So there's this residue of kind of reluctance that's still present here. So what does this tendency to resistance tell us? Though we concede to the artist the authority to welcome certain kinds of change, and thereby to constitute the work in a particular meaningful way, we maintain our attachment to conventional understandings of what it is for an artwork to persist through time and to fulfill its proper function. And we maintain the longings that proceed from this kind of attachment. So if you're thinking about the function of a traditional painting, you could think of that as something like the function of transmitting a specific appearance, which serves as a trace of the artist's touch. And when you're thinking about appearance versus the trace, you're obviously balancing things having to do with maintaining an original appearance, but also having to maintain original materials, which are subject to all of these forms of change. And so you end up having to welcome kinds of change in appearance that are linked to original materials, like moderate craquelure. That becomes something that's affirmatively valued because it is a sign that those materials maintain their historical connection to the original application, right? So when Murakami welcomes disintegration and Ferguson welcomes repainting of the painted surface, they are, even though they're kind of resisting that convention for the identity of the painting, they're not like preventing that convention from existing anymore. Like, it's still there and its force is still felt by us, right? Their works are meaningful precisely because they kind of resist the convention that remains in force. Now, artists working in other art forms, like installation art and sculpture that's constituted of non-art materials, can embrace change without prompting all of these same forms of resistance in many instances. Like we saw the fried egg work by Sarah Lucas a minute ago, and that's, replace the eggs. No problem. So like Sarah Z Carol Mancusi-Ungaro in the Artist Documentation Project did this great interview with Sarah Z about a small work of hers called Migrateur. And John Silberman, who's also there, he's actually the collector who at that time owned Migrateur. And Sarah Z was able to very gleefully talk about, well, you should replace this, but it's really important to keep this, and you should replace this when, and this other thing you should replace it when. And there was no problem there to talk about, yeah, there are going to be things that you replace, because what you wanted to do was maintain an appearance of the work being aged but not neglected. And you could have things aging on different timelines, and that was like okay with everybody. So sometimes there are still residues of resistance with works like this, but they're not prompted in the same way, and they don't speak in the same way to conventions that are bound with a specific art form like painting, where there's a very specific notion of what you should be hanging on to. But artistic practices like Z's, and there are of course many other much more dramatic examples of works that embrace change over time in installation art and sculpture. But I think works like this can have effects on the conventions of painting too. So as artists in many art forms continue to welcome extensive forms of material change as internal to their work, over time I think gestures like Murakami's gesture of embracing the flaking and Ferguson's gesture of embracing repainting are going to seem less and less dramatic and surprising and shocking, right? Over time, we don't, lots of artistic maneuvers that once surprised and shocked have just become kind of par for the course, or now like seem more central and valued. So once viewers can no longer feel any surprise or shock in relation to these works, but can only read that a work once had this effect, they are, to use a term of Michael Baxendale, they're observers now. They're no longer participants in a cultural moment. Now they're observers who have to kind of reconstruct what it was for the original participants to experience those works. So to the extent that our responses are still governed by a residue of resistance or longing, we remain participants. Our reluctance to welcome material change, rather than showing that the artist's sanction doesn't govern the work, instead shows that the power of the artist's communicative act is still kind of directly available to us. So, thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions, and I'm going to ask you to catch the eye, to catch Anne's eye, who will control the proceedings.
So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, Carolyn, a question about the restoration of the Darwin Martin house that we were talking about a little bit. But I lived a few doors down from the Darwin Martin house when I was teaching in Buffalo. And I was just thinking about what was lost after it was restored. When I was able to go through the house, the entire pathway to the conservatory, and the conservatory was gone, or solarium, and however you like to think about it. And it was kind of this magnificent experience to walk into the house and see the wisteria fireplace in the middle of a ruin. And the house told a completely different story then, because it told the story of the misery that is living in one of Frank Lloyd Wright's constructions, and how very unhappy the family was in that house, and how unhappy the couple was with the decision to live in that house, and how after the husband died, the wife just left the door open, and the weight of the snow collapsed the roof of the house. And so I wonder if that story is still told now that the restoration is done.
Well, it's been a while since I've taken a tour through the house. That one can visit it, but you have to go with a guide, a docent, and but usually those stories are told. They're hard to see. They're hard to encounter, I should say. I think the emphasis more is on what was there in the prime. Darwin Martin himself liked the house. His wife hated it, and she particularly disliked the windows, which is remarkable because they are the really spectacular things in the house. But she couldn't see outside very well because they're very refractory, and they're just not meant to lure you outside in the way that is now more typical. So I think it's very interesting. I think one of the things that your question raises is the difference between something that's on its way to becoming a ruin and something that is fully restored and could be functional. It happens to be a museum right now. They certainly do change their aesthetic resonance. I agree. Yeah. And that long, what she was referring to that was destroyed was 100 feet of pergola that ended in a conservatory. I could show a picture if the thing is, oh, never mind. It ended, I will, because it's actually sort of bizarre. While I find this, why don't you take another question, and then I'll come back to that so that we don't waste time with our fish here.
Okay.
It's a different PowerPoint.
Oh,
So
sorry.
what both Sherry was talking about and you as well is this notion of the fragment.
Yeah.
And that at a certain point in the object's life, it's going to be unrepairable. And when do we get to that point, that distance away from the artist's production, where we can actually accept the object as being static? And you brought up the point at the very end of, not maybe static, but we don't actually refer back to the artist in trying to inform our conservation decisions. And what you brought up at the very end of your presentation is the idea that we're engaged in some sort of narrative or dialogue with the artist, whether living or recently passed away, that we have actually imposed in on the artistic process. We did this. The artist may not have necessarily considered this to be part of the conservation practice until we came up with this idea of conserving contemporary art. So my question is, how do we resolve that part of it? And also this notion that at some point we really don't want to pay attention to what the artist has to say any longer.
So I guess I'm not sure I followed the first part. I mean, it's true that sometimes the institution resists certain kinds of things. Like the artist has given a permission and the institution's like, no, we're not doing that. And there are also cases in which, I mean, I know numerous cases in which, like there's a work by Canadian artist Liz Magor where there were these preserves and they started to decay and some of them developed botulism. And she had originally said, like, I just want this to like degrade and die, and then you throw it away when you can't exhibit it anymore. But then they kind of convinced her this is decaying and dying too fast. And so then she accepted that and, kind of agreed to remake some of the preserves. She like actually learned how to can to do that. So there certainly are cases in which the institution is going to push back against certain kinds of things the artist says. But I wasn't sure about the business about us imposing something.
So
and
the object at a certain
Yeah.
point changes from the artistic creation to be something that is more of a memento of our culture.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And so when does that take place? And how do we make that decision process to engage with the idea that it's a memento?
Okay. So yesterday there was some talk about the archive, and I think Glenn spoke some about the archive, and there was a question about like what happens when you lose the archive, and so I think it's true of various kinds of objects that when the head breaks off of the sculpture and you lose that, the sculpture can still, or when all of the paint is lost from the sculpture and now we thought it was white and then we found, like those things, it's like a thing can have aesthetic resonance for us as an aesthetic object without our having any sort of culturally specific knowledge about where it came from or who made it, or even if we have sort of a significant, we've lost a lot of that. But I do think that has to be understood as loss. And I think loss of the archive has to be understood as loss for these works in the same way that loss of the head of the sculpture has to be understood as loss relative to the original artwork. So that's kind of my suggestion. You might still have an entity that you can enjoy when you've lost the archive and you don't have the information about what the artist wanted you to do. But that is loss in just the way that losing the head of the sculpture and not knowing what it looked like anymore is loss of something important about that work. When does it happen? I think it has a lot to do with, when you lose something, you've lost it, and then you just have to make do with what you have left.
Let's go back to what Carolyn wanted to show us, and then we can.
Very quickly, but relating to this question, one of the reasons that this complex interests me so much is I think it raises a whole lot of puzzles about what counts as original. The photo on the screen right here is just of the conservatory, and you have to imagine 80 feet back is the pergola that you look down from the main house to. Can you tell what it is? It's the Winged Victory. It doesn't belong in Buffalo. It looks very, my own view, silly. But the fact is it was considered the jewel at the heart of the complex. Now, that was destroyed. The wrecking ball took it down. But Wright had 10 of them made, and the company that had the mold for it still existed. So they've recast this, not this one, the one that is there now, they've recast from the same mold. Is it an original? Well, it never was, really. So this is just indeterminate and maybe not hugely significant, except to indicate that you don't always have a one thing or another. You've got something muddy and indeterminate frequently, I think. But I do agree with the idea that at a certain point the object becomes it becomes the cultural object more than the artist's object, and it is sometimes lost. But it's very strange to imagine those Greek statues painted. You know, the Roman marble that were Greek statues. And it's the pristine, glowing white marble that's become the cultural object. And
We have 2 minutes, and I'd outlined three people, so Justin's passing his.
I'll get a chance later.
He'll get a chance later. And Sophie, would you like to ask yours?
Yes, quickly, a question for Sherry. It struck me that the artworks as well as the theories in conservation, modern and contemporary art that you presented often seem to function against the background that older art and also the conservation of older art work differently. And I wonder if that's the right way to go thinking about this, because there is a whole history of what is maybe not a very good term, but it's subsumized under the term ephemera art, which was produced for consumption and for using it and using it up, and that was perfectly fine, and there are contracts about this, and things can be reprinted, and throughout the whole history of art. So what could we gain, or is there any critical discourse about this within your field, that it doesn't only exist because this is so different about modern and contemporary art and conservation, but that there is actually also a line back into the past?
Right, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, in longer treatments, I think that would be really important to talk about ways in which there have been some analogous practices and in certain respects similar practices in the past. I'd say the difference when we think about some of these practices with contemporary art is that some of the rules that the artists are specifying are extremely fine-grained. So if you look at Sarah Z, for example, if you were to watch this interview that Carol Mancusi-Ungaro did with her about this she's done some huge works. This is a quite small work, Migrateur. But it has like Q-tips in it, and it has like packs of gum, and it's got aspirin tablets, and it's got Tic Tacs, and then it's got this glue from a glue gun that is kind of really spidery and kind of yellowing. And she's like, the glue has to stay. That reflects my touch at that time. You can't replace that. You accept the yellowing. The gum packs, on the other hand, like they're getting kind of saggy. The real gum's still in there. Just take it out and put in some rigid thing. This aspirin you should replace. This other aspirin is kind of interesting though, because the skin is still there and the interior has dissolved. So you should leave that alone because that's cool. And the Tic Tacs were bright green and they faded, so you should now put on new Tic Tacs. So she's doing this very fine-grained specification of what you should do to, both specific things that you should do, specific interventions, and also a kind of theory of, or an ideal conception of the work as having these interweaving timelines of decay. So there's this kind of fine-grained specification that the artist directly does now, which I think is, to my knowledge, but I'm not an expert in this, different from the kinds of practices that you're talking about. But they're also importantly related. Yeah.
I fear, for the sake of time, is that right? We need to stop?
I think we
I'm
had.
looking at you, but
Unfortunately, I know we began a little
Yes.
late, but we need to try to keep to the schedule, and
Yes,
there are
okay.
2 more sessions. So I just want to say I think it's really wonderful that it's the philosophers who introduced the idea of vagueness to the discussion, and I want to just ask everyone to thank Sherry Irvin and Carolyn Korsmeyer for their presentation.